The fog on Careth 9 was alive. It swirled between the twisted reeds and broken trees like a living creature, dense enough to swallow sound and light. The swamp stretched endlessly in every direction, a mosaic of black water, sinking islands, and slick roots that writhed under the cadets' boots. Every few seconds, something distant splashed, a wet, heavy sound that made the group freeze and glance around nervously. The air itself seemed thick enough to choke on, filled with the smell of decay and acid. For 3 days, the mixed species unit of the Galactic Academy had marched through that nightmare world, and now hunger was beginning to unmake them from the inside. The rations they carried had dissolved within hours of exposure to the planet's humidity. The packaged meals turned to grey sludge, and even the emergency nutrient bars bubbled and melted like wax. The Stealth cadets, whose translucent skin revealed trembling veins, had begun to move sluggishly. The Venari, proud and sharp-toothed, snapped irritably at one another over droplets of filtered rainwater. The feathered Rylax, usually so composed, plucked nervously at their plumage as if shedding fear through every twitch of a wing. Daniel Reeves, the only human in the group, sat on the edge of a decaying log and tried to swallow the emptiness in his stomach. His throat was raw from the damp air, and his uniform was soaked through. Even his boots, supposedly sealed for off-world missions, squelched with every step. He had been through worse, mountain training on Earth, jungle survival in the Amazon dome, but this was different. Careth 9 felt wrong, almost sentient, as if the entire ecosystem wanted them to fail. When he looked around the camp, he saw not soldiers, but frightened students. The Venari officer, Kor, had taken command on the first day, but now his once proud stance was crumbling. He barked orders in frustration, pacing in circles and blaming the instructors for abandoning them. The Stealth medic, Leora, tried to filter water through a carbon strip, but even that turned acidic within minutes. The Rylax huddled together, wings drooping, whispering in their melodic language about spirits in the mist. The group's last communication drone had vanished an hour earlier, swallowed by the fog without a trace. No signal, no lights, just gone. That silence said more than any transmission could. The exercise had shifted. This was no longer a controlled simulation. This was survival. Daniel looked at the sky, but even that was hidden. The constant drizzle of acidic moisture made it impossible to tell time. His instincts told him it was late afternoon, but there was no sun to confirm it. He rubbed the side of his arm, feeling the rough fabric scrape his skin, and tried to think. He had counted the rations, the water, the energy cells. None of it would last another day. He knew panic would come soon, and when it did, someone would make a mistake. He had seen it before. Desperation led to recklessness. Recklessness led to death. When the first Venari cadet collapsed into the mud, Daniel stood up immediately. The alien scales had lost their usual silver sheen, dulled to a pale grey. Leora rushed over, scanning the cadet's vitals with her handheld monitor. The screen flickered red before dying completely. The power cell was corroded. She threw it down and looked up helplessly. "He's dehydrated," she said, her voice trembling, "and malnourished. His blood pressure is crashing." Kor snarled something in his native tongue, blaming the humidity, blaming the academy, blaming fate. Daniel knelt beside the fallen cadet and pressed 2 fingers against the neck. The pulse was weak, but it was there. He looked up at the others, who stared back at him with wide, uncertain eyes. No one moved. No one offered a plan. Daniel stood, mud dripping from his knees. "We can't wait for rescue," he said evenly. His voice was calm, but beneath that calm was steel. "If we sit here, we'll all end up like him. I'm going to find food." Kor's eyes flashed. "You'll die out there," he hissed. "This swamp is alive. It eats anything that moves." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then I'll move quietly." He turned toward the edge of the clearing where the fog was thickest. Behind him, the aliens murmured, their voices a blend of fear and disbelief. Leora stepped forward, her translucent hand trembling. Human flesh isn't resistant to the toxins here, she warned. Even a touch from the wrong plant can burn through skin. Daniel met her gaze. Her eyes, large and glassy, reflected the fire of his determination. "I'll be careful," he said, "but someone has to try." He checked the knife on his belt, a standard-issue field blade, its edge dulled from constant use. He looked for anything usable as a spear shaft and found a section of broken tent pole. He wrapped the blade to it with strips torn from his sleeve, testing the weight. Crude, but workable. Around his neck hung a small metal pendant, nothing more than a flattened bullet casing from his grandfather's service. He rubbed it once, out of habit, before tucking it under his shirt. He took his first step into the fog. The sound of his boots sinking into the wet earth was louder than he expected. Each step was a negotiation with the ground, soft enough to swallow, but firm enough to stand on if he moved right. He stayed low, listening to the breathing of the swamp. Somewhere ahead, something groaned. A deep, wet sound, like air escaping from a buried lung. The vegetation around him pulsed faintly, glowing green veins running through translucent stems. He realized the plants here were not just alive. They were aware of light, sound, and maybe even warmth. He kept his breathing shallow. Every few meters, he marked his path by scratching small lines into the roots with his knife. If he got lost, he could follow the notches back. It was an old trick, but it calmed him. The deeper he went, the more the sounds changed. The croaks and clicks of smaller creatures gave way to the rhythmic thump of something heavy moving in the water. He crouched beside a pool and studied the ripples. They were too wide and too slow for fish. He brushed his finger through the liquid. It hissed faintly against his glove. Acidic, but diluted. He saw drag marks along the bank, large ones, maybe 1/2 meter across. Something big lived here. He followed the tracks, his spear balanced and ready. After several minutes, he came across a broken shell the size of a shield, split cleanly in half. The inner surface was charred, as if something had burned it from within. Whatever had done that was powerful and close. The mist shifted, carrying a new sound, a deep exhale, almost like a furnace. He froze, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. Through the fog, he glimpsed movement, a long shape gliding beneath the surface of a flooded channel. It was massive, silent, patient. The Marsh drake. The instructors had mentioned it once, calling it a regional hazard. The implication had been clear: avoid at all costs. Daniel's mouth went dry. But alongside fear came something else: clarity. The creature was dangerous, yes, but it was also meat, enough to feed the group for days. He watched the drake's pattern, timing its movements. It surfaced briefly, revealing a head covered in jagged plates and a jaw lined with curved teeth. When it submerged again, he exhaled slowly. He couldn't fight it head-on. He would have to be smarter. He gathered what he could: a cluster of fibrous reeds, some stones, and a fragment of an old supply crate half buried in mud. He wrapped the reeds into a bundle, soaked it in acidic water, and mixed in the remnants of a power cell's leaking battery fluid. It smelled vile, but that was the point. The swamp stank of decay. The drake would associate the scent with prey. By the time he finished setting the trap, the fog had darkened into near night. The sounds of the swamp grew louder, closer. He waited, crouched in the shallows, every muscle locked. Then, from the darkness, came a low rumble. The water broke apart as the drake surged upward, drawn by the bait's stench. Daniel raised his spear, waited for the glint of its gill plates, and threw with every ounce of strength he had left. The spear flew true, piercing flesh and vanishing into the water. The drake screamed, a horrifying metallic roar that echoed across the swamp. Daniel stumbled back as waves splashed against him. The creature thrashed, its tail whipping through the fog. He dived behind a fallen tree, breathing hard, mud covering his face. For a few long seconds, the noise was unbearable. Then silence. He lifted his head slowly. The surface of the water was red. The drake floated motionless, half submerged. Daniel stayed still for a full minute before standing. The swamp hissed softly, as if disappointed. He exhaled and wiped his brow. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. There would be time for that later, if he made it back. He turned toward the distant glow of the cadets' campfire, faint and flickering through the fog. Behind him, the water rippled once more, as if something deeper had noticed what he had done. He didn't look back. He adjusted his grip on the spear shaft, now blood-stained and heavy, and began the long walk home through the whispering mist of Kareth 9. Daniel's arms burned as he trudged through the swamp, dragging the limp, blood-soaked body of the marsh drake behind him. The creature's hide scraped against the roots and rocks, leaving a dark trail that bled into the murky water. The rain had started again, thick and steady, turning the world into a blur of sound and steam. Every step was an act of endurance. The body was impossibly heavy, and yet he refused to stop. He had already learned the rhythm of Kareth 9. If he stopped moving, something else would start. The swamp was patient, and it was always watching. He moved in silence, guided by the faint orange glow ahead, the reflection of the cadet's dim firelight through the mist. His thoughts narrowed into instinct. Each muscle movement was calculated, each breath shallow and measured. The drake's blood mixed with the mud around his boots, staining the ground in streaks of red and green. Its scales gleamed faintly, glistening even in death, and the faint chemical tang of its skin filled his nose. Somewhere far off, an echoing roar reminded him that this swamp was full of others like it. He didn't dare look behind. The smell of death carried far, and predators followed it like a signal. He moved faster, ignoring the cramps crawling through his legs. When he finally reached the camp, the cadets were huddled in a tight circle, their faces half lit by the weak light of a smouldering plasma torch. The sound of him dragging the carcass through the reeds made several of them leap to their feet in alarm. Kor, the Venari officer, raised his weapon instinctively before realizing what it was that Daniel carried. His jaw dropped. Leora covered her mouth in disbelief. The feathered Rylax froze, eyes wide, and feathers puffed in shock. Daniel let the drake's tail fall with a wet thud. "Food," he said simply, breath ragged and voice hoarse. No one spoke for several seconds. The rain crackled on the torch and hissed against the creature's skin. Kor stepped forward cautiously, as if expecting the monster to rise again. He tapped the hide with his claw and recoiled when it didn't move. "You killed this?" he demanded. His voice trembled between awe and anger. Daniel nodded once. "It's dead," he replied, "and it's clean enough to cook." Kor bared his teeth. "You fool! Do you even know what this is? Its blood corrodes armor plating. Its meat is venomous. You've doomed us all!" Daniel ignored him and began cutting into the carcass with his knife. The flesh steamed under the rain, releasing a sharp, metallic scent. The others backed away instinctively. The human worked with methodical precision, separating the layers of skin and peeling them back like armor panels. Beneath the hide, the meat was a deep purple, firm and elastic. He had no analyzer, no scanner, just experience and intuition. He cut a small piece, pressed it against a heated rock, and waited. The meat hissed, browned, and released an earthy, oily aroma. He watched the edges carefully. No bubbles, no black smoke. A good sign. Leora hesitated and knelt beside him. "You shouldn't touch it without gloves," she warned softly, but her voice lacked conviction. Hunger was stronger than fear. "If you're wrong..." He glanced at her, eyes calm. "Then I'll die first," he said, "and you'll know not to eat." The stealth medic's hands trembled slightly. "You shouldn't have to..." He cut her off gently. "I already did." He flipped the meat with a piece of scrap metal, waited a few seconds, and lifted it to his mouth. Every pair of eyes followed him. The rain fell harder, the torch sputtered, and time stretched thin. He bit into the slice, chewed, swallowed, and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he nodded, exhaled, and said, Safe. Leora blinked rapidly, as if trying to convince herself she believed him. She ran a quick test with her broken scanner, using what little power it had left. The screen flickered weakly before displaying a green pulse. "No toxins detected," she whispered in astonishment. "It's actually edible." Core hissed in disbelief. "This breaks every known biological rule of this planet. No one survives here by eating the local fauna. It's a death sentence." Daniel cut a larger piece and handed it to him. "Then don't eat. Starve if you prefer." His tone was steady, not mocking, just tired. "But this will keep us alive until extraction." The Venari glared at him, torn between pride and hunger. After a long pause, he took the piece and tore into it with his sharp teeth. The others watched for any sign of sickness or pain. None came. Slowly, almost reverently, the rest began to approach. Leora helped him cut more sections while the Rylax gathered branches and roots for a fire pit. Even the cautious ones, who had scoffed at the human hours earlier, joined in, driven by the smell of roasted flesh that filled the air. Daniel constructed a makeshift grill from the metal frame of a broken tent. He dug a pit with his bare hands, mixing dirt with crushed stones until he reached drier soil. Then he used a fragment of an old battery to spark the fire. When the flames finally caught, the light illuminated their faces in orange warmth. The aliens sat in a ring, silent, entranced by the flickering heat that no one thought possible on a planet soaked in acid rain. He skewered strips of meat and set them over the flame, turning them carefully. The sizzling sound filled the camp. Fat dripped into the fire, making it crackle. The smell was intoxicating, smoky, primal, alive. It made the hunger claw at everyone's insides. Daniel waited for the first batch to finish before offering it around. One by one, they took the food. No one spoke as they ate. Only the sound of chewing, rain, and the occasional sigh of relief broke the silence. Leora was the first to finish. She looked up at Daniel, her expression softening. "You saved us," she said quietly. "If you hadn't gone out there..." He shrugged. "Someone had to." Core's tone was begrudging but respectful. "You defied protocol, risked contamination, and somehow succeeded. You have no idea what this will mean when we report back." Daniel looked into the flames, his face lit by the firelight. "I don't care what it means," he said. "I just want everyone alive when that ship comes." For a few minutes, the world felt almost peaceful. The swamp's constant noise seemed distant, muffled by the rain. The aliens leaned back, finally full, warmth returning to their bodies. The campfire glowed like a small beacon of defiance against the hostile world surrounding them. But beneath that brief calm, Daniel's mind never stopped turning. He noticed every ripple in the water, every shift in the wind. He knew the smell of cooking meat would not go unnoticed. On Earth, predators came for the scent of blood. On Kareth 9, he suspected it would be worse. He quietly scanned the horizon, noting the faint movement of shadows beyond the mist. His hand never strayed far from his spear. As the others began to drowse, lulled by exhaustion and the comfort of food, Daniel remained awake. The fire cast flickering patterns on his face, and his reflection in the shallow water looked older than his years. He thought about the drake, about its size and power, and how easily the swamp had swallowed it. For a moment, he wondered if he had disturbed something greater, if Kareth 9 had rules that were not meant to be broken. He adjusted the fire, feeding it small pieces of dried bark to keep the flames low but alive. Behind him, Leora stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent. He watched the fog beyond the trees again. The air shimmered slightly, as if something massive was moving far off in the distance. He gripped his spear tighter. The night wasn't over. The swamp wasn't finished testing him. Still, when he looked back at the others, resting, breathing, alive, a faint sense of pride flickered through him. He had done what no one else dared to do. He had turned fear into survival. As the rain softened into mist again, he whispered to himself, barely audible over the crackling fire, Tomorrow, we hunt again. He didn't know whether it was a promise or a warning. The swamp, however, seemed to hear him. Somewhere in the darkness, something stirred, slow, deliberate, ancient. The faint glow of many eyes blinked open, just beyond the fog. The night listened. The human watched. And between them, the fire kept burning, a fragile symbol of defiance against a world that wanted them all gone. The dawn on Carath 9 was no brighter than the night. The fog had thinned only slightly, revealing a dull green light that filtered through the atmosphere, casting everything in the same sickly hue. The swamp steamed and whispered, as if waking from its own dream, and the stench of decay clung to every breath. Daniel was already awake, crouched near the remains of the fire. His face was streaked with mud, his eyes sunken from exhaustion. The others still slept in a fragile heap, wrapped in scraps of soaked fabric and their own exhaustion. The fire had burned low, its last embers faintly glowing beneath a layer of damp ash. He stirred it quietly, feeding it bits of dried bark until it came alive again with reluctant light. He didn't light it for warmth or comfort anymore. He lit it to remind himself that something human still existed in this alien wasteland. He had barely slept, maybe an hour or two at most. His body ached from dragging the drake, from fighting the weight of the swamp, from the unrelenting humidity that clung to his lungs like glue. But worse than fatigue was the noise, a constant background of distant movements, splashes, and occasional low growls. The swamp was never silent. Even now, in the grey morning, he could hear ripples breaking against roots, something large shifting through the shallows. The predators hadn't forgotten the scent of blood. He knew they would come again. He glanced toward the others. Kor slept sitting upright, his scaled arms crossed, his weapon resting against his leg. Even in sleep, the Venari's jaw twitched, his instincts still half alert. Leora was curled near the fire, her breathing shallow but steady, her skin faintly glowing under the green light. The Rylax had formed a ring at the edge of the camp, their feathers puffed to stay warm, wings draped protectively around each other. It would have been peaceful, almost, if not for the uneasy silence between heartbeats, that unnatural stillness that only existed right before something went wrong. Daniel rose, slinging his spear across his shoulder. His boots squelched softly in the mud as he stepped away from the camp. The air was cold against his face, and his reflection wavered in the dark water. He followed the same trail he had made dragging the drake, partly to check if anything had followed, and partly to think. His thoughts drifted to the ship that was supposed to retrieve them in 2 days. If the instructors were still monitoring their vitals, they would see that everyone was alive, which meant no early extraction. Survival was success. The irony of that fact made him smile bitterly. Halfway down the trail, he found what he had expected. Footprints. Not his, not anyone from camp. These were wider, heavier, with claws that dug deep into the mud. Fresh. He crouched, touching one of the impressions lightly. The edges were still sharp. Whatever had made them had been there less than an hour ago. He looked up and scanned the horizon. The fog was shifting again, rippling like water, moving unnaturally fast. The predators were circling. He turned back toward camp, quickening his pace. When he returned, Kor was already awake, pacing in front of the fire with his claws flexing anxiously. The Venari looked up sharply. "You were gone again," he snapped, without a word. "You think this place is your personal hunting ground?" Daniel stopped at the edge of the firelight. "Something's tracking us," he said calmly. "Big, clawed, more than one." Kor's nostrils flared. "Nonsense. We would have heard." A deep growl interrupted him, low and resonant, vibrating through the water. The cadets froze. Another sound followed, closer this time. A splash, then the wet scrape of something dragging itself across the mud. The Rylax stood, feathers bristling. Leora moved beside Daniel instinctively, clutching her medical pouch like a weapon. The swamp around them had gone deathly quiet. Daniel raised his hand. "Extinguish the fire," he whispered. Kor hesitated. "What? No, that's—" "Do it," Daniel hissed. "It's drawing them." Leora quickly kicked wet soil over the flames, smothering them until only a faint glow remained. The air filled with the heavy scent of smoke and mud. The fog pressed closer, curling between the trees. The first shape appeared through it, massive, reptilian, eyes glowing faintly orange. Then another, then two more. The predators were smaller than the drake he had killed, but faster, leaner, their bodies rippling with muscle, their mouths opened, showing rows of curved teeth slick with slime. Kor raised his weapon and aimed, but Daniel grabbed his arm. "Don't shoot, not unless you want every creature on this planet coming here." Kor glared, his pupils narrowing to slits. "Then what do you suggest, human?" Daniel scanned the surroundings, mind racing. "We need a distraction. They're hunting by smell and sound." His gaze fell on the scraps of drake meat still hanging from the makeshift racks. "Help me." He tore the meat into smaller pieces and wrapped them in torn fabric. Leora understood instantly, helping him tie the bundles. The predators growled louder, pacing just beyond the edge of visibility. Their silhouettes shifted in the fog, restless and hungry. When the first one lunged forward, Daniel hurled one of the bundles into the water far to the right. The splash drew its attention immediately. The others followed, splintering toward the sound. Daniel threw another bundle farther out, and another. Each time, the creatures darted toward it, their movements violent and unpredictable. "Move," Daniel whispered. "Now!" The group scrambled quietly in the opposite direction, staying low and close to the trees. The mud sucked at their boots, threatening to slow them, but fear kept them moving. Leora's breathing was sharp and quick. Kor kept looking back, his claws twitching. Daniel led them along a curved path, deliberately avoiding the areas where the ground bubbled or shifted. He knew enough by now to recognize those signs: gas pockets, quick mud, and worse things lurking beneath. After several minutes, the growls faded. The group stopped near a cluster of thick roots that formed a natural shelter. Daniel motioned for silence, listening. Only the swamp answered, distant drips and croaks, but no pursuit. He exhaled, leaning against a tree. Leora looked at him, her expression caught between gratitude and fear. "How did you know that would work?" she whispered. He gave a small shrug. "Predators are predictable. Hunger makes them stupid." Kor crossed his arms, still breathing heavily. "Or you're lucky." Daniel looked at him, the faintest trace of a smile flickering across his face. "Luck doesn't drag dinner back to camp." Kor hissed, but didn't reply. The tension between them was almost physical now, an invisible thread stretched to its limit. The Venari had begun to resent him openly, and Daniel could see it growing with every success he achieved. Authority mattered more to Kor than survival. But Daniel didn't care about pride or command. He cared about staying alive. He crouched and began examining the roots around them. The base of the largest tree was hollowed out, creating a small dry space beneath it. Perfect for cover. He motioned to the others to crawl inside. The air was thick and humid, but it was at least hidden. When everyone was settled, Daniel pulled the remaining scraps of meat close and began setting up smoke racks again, smaller this time, lower to the ground. Leora frowned. "You're still cooking?" He nodded. "We'll need the smell to fade into the swamp. If it lingers around us, we'll be tracked again." Kor scoffed quietly. "You're insane. That will just bring them back." Daniel didn't even look up. "Not if I do it right." He used damp wood and green leaves, producing a slow, heavy smoke that clung to everything. The scent masked their presence, blending human and alien into the natural miasma of the planet. Within minutes, even Kor stopped objecting. The result worked. The noises of the swamp began to return to normal, as if the predators had moved on. When the tension eased slightly, Daniel sat down, exhaustion finally breaking through. His hands trembled as he cleaned the knife against his sleeve. The blade was pitted from acid, but still sharp. Leora sat across from him, watching quietly. "You think this is over?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Not even close. The swamp never stops testing us. The moment we let our guard down, It'll take someone. She was silent for a long moment, then said, "You talk like it's alive." He looked into the mist and replied, "I think it is." For a while, neither spoke. The Relax murmured softly in their sleep, their wings twitching like leaves. Kor eventually dozed off, still gripping his weapon. Daniel stared into the fading smoke until his vision blurred. He thought about the strange rhythm of the planet, how everything seemed to feed on fear and hesitation. The longer one hesitated, the closer death came. He wondered if that was why humans adapted so well, because hesitation had been bred out of their instincts long ago. When his eyelids finally grew heavy, he rested his back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes, but only lightly. Even asleep, his fingers remained wrapped around the handle of his knife. The swamp crooned softly, like a predator humming a lullaby. Somewhere far in the distance, something massive bellowed, not in rage, but in acknowledgement. It was as if the world itself had noticed the intruders and decided to let them live, for now. Daniel didn't dream that night. His mind stayed half awake, half alert, balanced between exhaustion and vigilance. And though no predator attacked again before dawn, the sound of slow ripples and faint breathing beyond the roots reminded him that Kareth 9 never truly slept. The next day began without warning, as it always did on Kareth 9. There was no sunrise, no shift in the sky, only a faint thinning of the fog that turned blackness into a kind of pale sickness. Daniel opened his eyes to the sound of something dripping. The rain had stopped, but condensation still fell from the twisted branches above, hitting the swamp water with dull, rhythmic splashes. His muscles screamed in protest as he pushed himself upright. The hollow beneath the tree had protected them through the night, but the smell of smoke still clung to their clothes, heavy and bitter. He stepped out into the open, stretching his shoulders, and scanned the perimeter. The air was eerily calm, too calm. The swamp had moods, and this one felt wrong. It was holding its breath. He turned toward the others. Leora was already awake, kneeling beside a small pool of filtered water. Her translucent skin caught the faint light like glass, revealing veins pulsing faintly blue beneath. She was checking on the wounded Venari cadet who had collapsed 2 days earlier. The alien's breathing had steadied, though his eyes remained half closed. Kor stood on the opposite side of the clearing, his scales slick with moisture, watching Daniel with a mix of suspicion and reluctant respect. The Rylax were grooming their feathers silently, their sharp beaks picking off mud and parasites. The group was alive, but just barely. The exhaustion had burrowed into their bones. Daniel moved to the smoking racks, checked the meat. It had dried properly overnight, forming a tough, leathery surface that would resist decay for at least a few more days. He packed several strips into a cloth bag, then poured some of the cleaner water into a metal canteen. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. He had learned that on Kareth 9, noise attracted attention faster than blood. When Leora looked up, he gestured for her to join him. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "The drake's blood is still in the water. More will come." She nodded immediately. "Where will we go?" He pointed toward the east, where the fog seemed thinner. "There's higher ground that way. If we find dry rock, we can build something safer. I want to get us out of this mire before nightfall." Kor overheard and strode closer, his claws digging small furrows in the mud. "You're not giving orders, human," he growled. "I'm still the commanding officer of this unit." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "Then lead," he said, "as long as you walk in that direction." For a moment, it seemed Kor would strike him. The Venari's tail twitched, his jaw flexed. But pride alone wouldn't feed him, and even arrogance had limits in the face of starvation. He spat into the mud and turned away. "Fine," he said. "We move east." The group began their slow march through the swamp. The water was waist-deep in some areas, black and cold, with unseen creatures brushing against their legs. Daniel carried the spear in one hand and a length of vine in the other, which he used as a guide rope for the weaker cadets. The ground shifted beneath them, sometimes solid, sometimes collapsing into muck that swallowed feet to the ankle. Leora stumbled several times, her body not built for such terrain, and each time Daniel caught her by the arm, pulling her upright. Hours passed in suffocating silence. The fog thickened again, swallowing the shapes of trees and pools alike. The air vibrated faintly, as if something enormous was moving below the surface. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to stop. He raised his hand. The group froze. A second later, the sound came, a deep rumble like thunder beneath the mud. Then another. The water began to tremble. "Run!" he said sharply. The surface exploded behind them. A massive serpentine creature burst from the water, its hide a mosaic of glistening plates and ridges. It was longer than the drake, faster, more primal. Its head reared up, tongue flicking through the air, tasting them. The Venari shouted something and fired his weapon, the plasma bolt vanishing into the beast's side with little effect. The sound only enraged it further. It lunged forward, jaws snapping shut around the space core had occupied a second earlier. The shockwave threw Daniel into the mud, his ears ringing. He scrambled up, grabbed his spear, and yelled, "This way!" The others followed blindly through the murk, splashing, tripping, gasping for breath. The creature roared again, the sound vibrating through the swamp like a physical force. Daniel looked back. It was following, its movement fluid and terrifyingly fast for its size. It tore through trees as if they were paper. Ahead, the ground began to rise. The higher slope was covered in slick roots and rocks, but it was solid. Daniel pushed Leora forward, grabbing her arm when she slipped. "Climb!" he shouted. She dug her hands into the mud, her delicate fingers trembling, but she climbed. The Rylax used their talons to grip the bark, hauling themselves upward with surprising strength. Kor turned and fired again, his shots illuminating the fog with flashes of blue light. Daniel found a broken branch thick as his arm and jammed it into a crevice between rocks. "Grab it!" he yelled, pulling Leora up beside him. He felt the earth shake again as the beast rammed the slope, its head smashing into the base of the hill. Chunks of rock tumbled loose. The creature opened its mouth, and a spray of acidic bile splattered across the slope, sizzling through roots and stone alike. Daniel shielded his face with his arm. The smell of burning vegetation filled the air. "Keep moving!" he shouted. He grabbed Kor by the arm and dragged him up the incline when the Venari's footing slipped. The officer tried to pull free, snarling, but Daniel's grip was iron. They reached a ledge large enough for all of them to collapse onto, gasping for air. The creature below hissed, circling, frustrated by the barrier of stone. Its tail lashed the water, sending waves crashing against the slope. For several long minutes, no one spoke. Only the sound of the beast's breathing filled the air. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Leora was the first to break the silence. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel watched the creature's outline through the fog. Its eyes burned faintly, and the ridges along its spine glowed with a dull bioluminescence. "Something old," he said softly. "Maybe older than the academy itself." Kor spat into the water below. "Then we kill it before it kills us." Daniel shook his head. "We're not killing that thing. Not with what we have." He looked around, studying the terrain. The ledge extended into a narrow ridge that wound upward through the mist. "We move when it leaves. Until then, stay quiet." Hours passed before the creature finally sank back into the swamp, its body vanishing beneath the water with a slow, reluctant motion. Daniel waited until the ripples faded before he rose to his feet. The others followed, moving carefully along the ridge. The higher they climbed, the thinner the fog became, and for the first time since they had landed, Daniel saw light. Not sunlight, but the faint shimmer of bioluminescent moss clinging to the rocks. The glow illuminated a small plateau above them. When they reached it, the view nearly stole his breath. The swamp stretched endlessly in every direction, a dark sea of mist and twisted trees. But here, on this outcropping, the ground was dry, the air cleaner. Strange plants with crystalline leaves grew between the rocks, and small insect-like creatures hovered above them. their wings humming softly. It felt almost sacred, untouched by the chaos below. Leora knelt, touching the glowing moss with reverence. "It's warm," she whispered. "This could be geothermal. We can rest here." Daniel nodded, scanning the horizon one last time before setting down his pack. "We'll make camp here. No fire this time. Just rest." The others obeyed without argument. Exhaustion had stripped them of pride and caution alike. As they settled among the rocks, Daniel sat apart from the group, watching the fog below. He could still see faint ripples where the creature had vanished. His mind wouldn't rest. He knew it would come back. Not for food, not for instinct, but for vengeance. Kareth 9 wasn't just testing them anymore. It was reacting to them. He ran a hand through his soaked hair, feeling the grit under his fingernails. Every survival lesson he had ever learned seemed small here, primitive against a world that followed no rules he understood. Yet he also felt something deeper stirring within him. Not fear, but defiance. Humanity had always been small in the face of the unknown, and yet it had always endured. If this planet wanted to break them, it would have to try harder. Behind him, the cadets slept fitfully, their dreams haunted by the roar that still echoed faintly in the fog. Daniel stayed awake, his spear resting across his knees. The air pulsed faintly, warm from the moss beneath him. Somewhere below, the swamp breathed again. He could feel it, slow, ancient, and waiting. But for now, he breathed with it, steady and unbroken. The human was still alive, and as long as he drew breath, the swamp had not won. The plateau remained eerily still through the next cycle, its glowing moss casting an unearthly radiance across the rocks. The air smelled faintly of minerals and warmth, and for the first time in days, the cadets could breathe without tasting rot. Daniel sat alone at the ridge's edge, his eyes fixed on the sea of fog below. The swamp stretched endlessly, hiding the horrors that lurked beneath its surface, yet he could feel the creature's presence even now. Not near, but not gone either. It was somewhere out there, waiting for a weakness, watching for movement. The thought didn't frighten him anymore. Fear had burned out of him, replaced by a cold, deliberate focus. Behind him, the others slept in uneasy clusters. Leora had used the last of her medical gel to treat the Venari cadet's burns, wrapping his arms in strips of moss that radiated a faint heat. Kor paced like a caged animal, unable to rest, his pride still at war with the reality of their survival. The Rylax murmured softly in their sleep, perhaps dreaming of wind and open skies, something this suffocating world would never offer. Daniel listened to the rhythm of their breathing, slow and fragile, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. The quiet didn't last. A tremor rolled beneath the rocks, subtle but steady. Leora sat up at once, eyes wide. "An earthquake," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "No, it's something moving under us." The ground shuddered again, harder this time. Pebbles rolled across the plateau, and a low moan rose from deep within the earth. Kor snarled, drawing his weapon. "It followed us," he hissed. "That thing is beneath us." Before Daniel could answer, the ridge cracked like thunder. A fissure tore through the rock, splitting the moss field in half. Steam burst upward in thick white columns, scalding the air. The cadets scrambled to their feet, shouting, slipping on the slick surface. From below came a rumbling bellow, the same sound that had haunted them for days, now impossibly close. The creature was tunneling upward, breaking through the crust. "Move!" Daniel shouted. "To the far side!" The group ran, stumbling over uneven stone as the plateau crumbled behind them. A massive section of the ridge collapsed, swallowed by darkness. Daniel caught Leora's arm just before she fell, pulling her back with all his strength. The beast's head erupted from the fissure, enormous, dripping with mud and slime, its glowing eyes filled with fury. The smell hit them first, a sharp stench of sulfur and blood. Kor fired his weapon repeatedly, blue plasma bolts striking the creature's armored snout. The light reflected off its hide, leaving only faint scorch marks. The drake roared, sweeping its tail upward through the gap. The impact knocked Kor backward into a pile of rocks. He groaned, stunned, but alive. Daniel grabbed a splintered metal rod from the ground and jammed it into the rock to anchor himself. The creature's movements shook the entire plateau. It was trying to climb up. Leora screamed as part of the ledge gave way beneath her. Daniel lunged forward, catching her by the wrist just as her body slipped over the edge. Her feet dangled above the chasm, the fog swallowing everything below. "Hold on!" he shouted. His muscles strained as he pulled her up, his boots sliding across the moss. She gasped, tears mixing with the sweat and grime on her face. "You're not letting go!" she cried. "Not today," he said through gritted teeth. With a final heave, he dragged her onto solid ground. The creature slammed its head into the cliff again, spraying chunks of stone into the air. Daniel's mind raced. There was no killing it. Not here. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bury it. He looked around, scanning the terrain. Steam still vented through cracks in the rock, hot enough to burn through cloth. Geothermal fissures, unstable and deadly. An idea formed, reckless, but the only one that might work. He turned to Kor, who was climbing back to his feet, weapon still in hand. "We can't outrun it," Daniel said, "but we can bring the mountain down on it." Kor's eyes widened. "You're mad. That will kill us all." Daniel pointed to the fissures. "Not if we control the collapse. The heat vents run straight through. If we overload one with plasma fire, the pressure will explode outward. It'll take the beast with it." Leora shook her head, panic rising in her voice. "You'll never escape in time." He met her gaze. "I don't need to. I just need to hold it long enough." Before anyone could stop him, he sprinted toward the largest vent, the one belching the most steam. The creature's massive claw tore through the ridge behind him, smashing stone like glass. Daniel ducked under it, rolled, and jammed his spear into the crack. The metal vibrated from the heat. He turned, seeing the others frozen in disbelief. "When it blows," he shouted, "run east, down the slope, and don't look back." Kor hesitated, jaw tight. Then, for the first time, he nodded, a silent salute. Leora's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Daniel gave her a single look, not goodbye, but understanding. The creature lunged again, its head breaking through the rock until its jaws were inches away. Daniel grabbed Kor's fallen plasma rifle from the ground and aimed it straight into the vent. The heat was unbearable. His skin blistered as the weapon hummed in his hands. The creature roared, its fetid breath washing over him. He pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening. The plasma charge tore into the vent, igniting the pressurized gas beneath the surface. The explosion came an instant later, a blinding white flash that consumed sound and sight. The ground split apart, molten rock spraying upward in violent arcs. The beast screamed, thrashing, its body engulfed by fire and stone. The shockwave hurled Daniel backward, slamming him into the rocks. Pain exploded through his chest, but he forced his eyes open. He saw the creature fall, first its head, then its massive frame collapsing into the fissure, swallowed by molten light. The plateau shuddered one final time, then went still. Smoke and ash filled the air, choking and hot. Daniel coughed, dragging himself upright. The world blurred at the edges. He could hear voices faintly, Leora shouting his name, Kor calling orders, but it all felt distant. He stumbled toward the ridge, every step an act of will. When he reached the edge, he saw the swamp below, glowing faintly from the lava that now ran through the cracks. The monster was gone. Leora appeared beside him, eyes wide and wet. "You're hurt," she said, her voice breaking. He smiled faintly, blood on his lips. "You're alive. That's what matters." Kor climbed up next, dragging the others behind him. He stared down at the molten chasm where the creature had fallen, then looked at Daniel. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his gaze, only respect. "You did it," he said quietly. Daniel nodded weakly. "No," he murmured. "We did." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of scorched stone instead of decay. Above them, for the first time since arrival, A faint sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, pale, fragile, but real. The cadets stood in silence, watching as the fog began to dissolve. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of engines echoed through the air. The rescue ships were coming. When the shuttles landed hours later, the instructors found the survivors sitting among the rocks, hungry, filthy, and silent. The swamp below had turned into a field of steam and glowing embers. Daniel sat apart, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes half closed. An officer asked what had happened. He said nothing at first, just looked toward the horizon where the sun was struggling to rise. Finally, he said, "We adapted." The report would later describe it as an anomaly, an unprecedented success on a planet considered impossible to survive. The cadets who returned spoke of teamwork, leadership, and human ingenuity. But among themselves, they told a different story, of one man who taught them that courage wasn't about strength, but about refusing to surrender when the world itself seemed to reject you. When the ship broke through the atmosphere, Daniel watched the green fog of Carith 9 fade beneath him. His hands were blistered and raw, but his mind was clear. He thought of the fire, the swamp, and the creature that had nearly destroyed them. Then he thought of the moment when the others had looked to him, not as an outsider, but as their guide. The Academy would call it a training success. History would call it survival. But Daniel knew the truth. It was something simpler and far more human. He had fed the hungry, led the lost, and stared into the jaws of a world that wanted him dead. And in doing so, he had proved what humanity always did best. He had endured.